One of the most interesting questions in ecology is why are there so many species? And what I mean by that is how can there be so many species that live together? For example, in this grassland behind us, we have literally counted 64 different species right there. How can they be living together? In this environment, it experiences the same general climate, the same daily weather, there's the same soil and the same rock substrate. So how can there be so many species here? Or if we ask the opposite question, why is it that we don't have just one or two really efficient species, the most efficient species? So in a previous video, I talked about this topic and I used the example of 39 bromeliad species in the pineapple family that live together on a hilltop in central Panama, Cerro Jefe. The video, if you want to search for it, is called The Mystery of the 39 Bromeliads. And in that particular example, we have a slightly different situation because the environment is actually fairly old compared to what we have here. In central Panama, well, Panama itself has an age of around 3 million years. Due to plate tectonics and volcanic activity, the Isthmus of Panama rose up around about 3 million years ago. And this created what we call nowadays the Great American Biotic Interchange, or GABI, which is basically the movement of organisms from North America to South America and South America to North America using Panama as a land bridge. So basically in that example, we have a situation where we have species arriving and species evolving in place. There were endemic species there that are only found there, and basically the biodiversity can be explained by longer term processes operating in several million years that create the particular mix of species that are found there. Here it's a little bit different. You might be able to see behind me that basically we're in a glacial valley. This is a U-shaped valley where up until about 12,000 years ago there would have been a glacier. So the glacier would have come down from the north and then going towards Milan, the Po Plain, which is over in that direction towards the south. So until around 12,000 years ago, this place was under ice. The other thing that's very particular about this place is, as you can see, the land has been shaped and changed by humans. So we have these terraces, which are basically a sign of agricultural activity, small-scale agricultural activity. And so there's a very definite human impact here. In fact, we call this a semi-natural grassland because there is a huge human impact, anthropogenic impact here. And I can't put an exact date on when these grasslands were first formed, but we do know, for example, that there were Roman remains found around here, and the main church down in the town was built in the 14th century. So a settlement, a substantial settlement for at least 600 years, a little bit more maybe. And we know that until about 200 years ago, there were roughly 150 people that lived in this general area. So when it comes to the age of this particular environment here, this specific grassland, we're talking something in the order of several hundred years. So there's a big difference here between a stable environment in the tropics where processes have had millions of years to build up and accumulate biodiversity, and a situation such as this where essentially on the geological timescale it's brand new and heavily influenced by human activity. So in the title I've made an analogy that the biodiversity that's been created here is like making a pizza. Okay, why the analogy? It sounds dumb, but I promise it's not. So to make a pizza, what I actually mean is it's a two-step process. You have long-term processes which are basically about getting the ingredients. So agricultural activity, the production of wheat and a clean source of water, yeast, salt, milk to make mozzarella cheese, and so the longer term agricultural activities create the list of ingredients. The next step, the second step in making the pizza, of course, is what happens in the kitchen or the pizzeria. and that's putting those ingredients together and cooking them to make the pizza. So the analogy with a grassland, the analogy in the natural world, is that there are longer term processes which create the ingredients list. And then there are short-term processes which put those ingredients together. In ecology, we would call this assembly, to make the final realized situation. The longer-term processes are to do with evolution by means of natural selection. And as Darwin pointed out, evolution, the change over generations, can bring about a situation of speciation, because different parts of a population can encounter different ecological conditions and take their own paths and become different species. It's something that in evolution we call diversifying selection. In modern evolutionary studies, there's a central concept which builds on natural selection, and it's also very pertinent to ecology, and it's called adaptive radiation. It means that that process of speciation is occurring through space and over time, as different groups of individuals find different ecological situations. So the general effect is not just change and evolution with generations. It's not just natural selection. It's not just speciation, but occupying and adapting to a range of ecological situations which brings about a range of different taxa, a range of different species. Okay. So from our example from the tropics, from Panama, we can imagine that there, where it's relatively stable climatically, there are seasons, but the difference between the wet and the dry season isn't all that great. There's been no glaciation. There have been no major disturbances, and that biodiversity has accumulated by a process of adaptive radiation. Here, then, we're saying that the environment is much younger, okay, really a lot younger. So actually the species that are found here, we know that they evolved between around 3 and 12 million years ago. So they didn't do that here. None of the species here is endemic. None of them evolved in this place, okay. They came from other grasslands around about. Maybe there were natural grasslands up here on the mountain. There are rocky outcrops where there's no woodland, and maybe there were little patches of grassland up here on the mountain. And with humans creating this more extensive, suitable habitat, then they've come down and occupied and created really an extensive grassland. But what we have here is essentially a situation that lets us kind of ignore the evolutionary side of it for now. We know that evolution has had an effect here because there are different families of flowering plants, there are different species, so there is what we call a phylogenetic effect. But it allows us to concentrate on the shorter term processes, the kind of day-to-day, within the time scale of an individual lifetime, these kind of processes that we deal with in ecology. So here, in this particular grassland, we conducted a study several years ago now, but we conducted a study where we looked at the species that were here, the whole list of species, what we call the flora, and we looked at where those particular plants were. In practice, in this grassland behind me, we placed transects, so literally there were 5-meter long lines, and we did this 16 times, so 16 replicate transects. And at every single centimetre, we looked at the identity of the species that were there, and we worked out 2 things. We worked out, firstly, their functional type, which we'll talk about in a minute, but we also were able to calculate, actually put a number on how aggregated the particular species were. So where you have several points along that line, and it's all that species, you can say that they're clumped together, aggregated, or dispersed. And what we found was that in this grassland, basically there are 4 or 5 species which are what we call dominants. They're the most frequent, the most abundant species. And in terms of how they work, in terms of their functional types, we characterize them in the context of Grimes' CSR triangle. I have other videos explaining CSR, but as a very quick overview, basically plants, when they get resources, they have a kind of dilemma with what to do with these resources. They can invest those resources in getting more resources, which means growing big quickly. And Philip Grime, the British ecologist, called this approach to life, this strategy, the competitor strategy, or we can also, in evolutionary speak, we can talk about C-selection. Okay, and if you plot this as a triangle, the C-selected plants are plotted up at the top corner. Plants can, however, survive by investing their resources in maintenance, in maintaining their tissues. They do this where it's not very productive, there aren't many resources, and there's a risk that metabolism is slow, growth is slow, and so they're really conserving and protecting those resources. And we call these plants stress tolerators. It doesn't really matter what the stress is. It could be a low temperature, it could be high temperature, it could be too much light, it could be toxic minerals in the soil. The general effect is to slow metabolism, slow growth, and slow productivity. Then particular plants are adapted to particular stresses in particular ways, but underlying that, there's a fundamental conservative way of growth, which we call stress tolerance. And the other corner of the triangle is something that we call ruderalism, or R-selection. And this is where the environment is potentially productive, there are plenty of resources, but every now and again the plants that have already grown, so this is after the process of growth, those plants get destroyed by something, such as being mown or grazed, or fire, something that destroys the tissues. So stress is about preventing the biomass from accumulating, from growing, whereas ruderalism is about the biomass being destroyed after it's made. And ruderals are adapted by completing their life cycle very, very quickly. So they're very small when they become adult, and when they flower, when they reproduce. So using this CSR system, we were able to characterize the plants in this grassland. And what we found was that there were several dominant species, several species that had a high abundance, and they were all down towards the S corner. They were all stress tolerators. So to be dominant in this grassland, you have to be a stress tolerator. But watch out. They all survive together, and to do this they have a slightly different strategy. So there's a general convergence towards stress tolerator down in this S corner, but within that corner the different dominant species are slightly different from one another. There's a divergence within this convergence. Okay, so that's how the dominant species coexist. Now here it gets really interesting. There are several subordinate species that don't account for a lot of the cover, the ground cover here. And we found that basically the dominant species were forming clumps, so big clumps of plants, and the subordinate species were physically, spatially distributed between the clumps of the dominant species. So there's a kind of spatial reason for how they can survive alongside, how they can coexist alongside the dominant species. But there's lots and lots of subordinates, and if you look at the CSR triangle, they actually spread out to fill most of the triangle. They don't go right into the R-selected corner, they don't go right into the C-selected corner, but they do spread out and fill most of the CSR triangle. So there's a lot of functional variability here. Now it is a generally stressful site. In the summer it gets very, very hot. It can get to about 40 degrees Celsius. I'm not sure what that is in Fahrenheit, but it's enough that when you're sitting still, not doing anything, you're sweating. Okay, it gets that hot. The soil is only about 40 centimeters deep throughout, and it gets dry. It gets hot and dry in the summer, and it gets cold in the winter as well. So there are abiotic environmental factors which represent survival risks for the plants. Okay. In evolutionary speak, they're selection pressures. The main selection pressures are abiotic, climatic, and from the soil, edaphic. In fact, this particular type of environment, this habitat, is recognized as what we call a xeric sand calcareous grassland. So a dry, sandy soil, calcareous bedrock. We can see the calcareous rocks in the mountains around us, grassland. So xeric sand, calcareous grassland. And that reflects the fact that the soil is well drained, it's very, very thin, it doesn't really hold the water. And along with the heat that this place gets in summer, I mean, at the moment it's the start of March and I'm under the sun, and I'm sure that at night time it's going to get very cold here, but at the moment I'm almost sweating, okay? So it is a stressful place. So aside from the stress factors that are found in this environment, there is also some disturbance. This is a meadow, and meadows by definition are mown or cut. Pastures are grazed, meadows are mown. And that does mean that there is some removal of biomass, some disturbance, but it happens at a height of around 7 centimeters. We measured this. It doesn't go right down to soil surface. And in this particular place where things are maintained by hand, I mean literally with scythes, it's not done in a uniform way in space and in time. There'll be patches that are done in 1 year, patches that are done in another year. So some areas which have been mown, some areas which will be mown the next year. And this creates opportunity. So there is stress and there is some disturbance, but it's not a stressful environment and an environment with intense, frequent disturbance. So why is there a mixture of different survival strategies amongst the subordinate species? Well, here it's not just about spatial distribution within the grassland, it's also about time, temporal distribution. And what we can see from the triangle is that we have species that are towards the R-selected corner, and these are smaller, shorter species that tend to flower early in the season when the dominant grasses are very low. And as the season progresses, the grasses grow higher and higher and higher. The light at ground level becomes much less, and the subordinate species shift towards the more competitive corner. Now, in fact, I was interested in the orchids that are growing here. I wanted to understand how there can be 7 different species of orchids growing right here together. And the idea was that they have the same general way of surviving, but they have very different flowers, so they have different pollinators. I thought it was that simple. But what I actually found surprised me. What I found was that at the start of the season, from late March onwards, we have the low dominant species, the low grass, and the orchids that are flowering are very small. They're very small. Anacamptis moreo and species of bee orchids such as Ophrys flavicans and Ophrys sphygioides. And as we go through the months, as the grass starts growing and there's more canopy height, this shifts towards other orchids, which surprised me, because when I looked at them, when I measured them, they were actually pretty big, and I really didn't think that they would be. But we go through species such as Neotinia ustulata and Serapias vomeracea, and towards the summer, so towards the end of June, the start of July, we get orchids that are actually really quite big, Anacamptis pyramidalis and Neotinia tridentata. So this allowed us to actually come back and answer the question, how can there be so many species, how can there be so many orchids living together and coexisting in this grassland? So there are actually several answers. Firstly, in order to be a dominant species here, you have to be a stress tolerator, but slightly different from the other stress tolerators. To be a subordinate species, you have to be able to be small enough to occupy the physical gaps between the clumps of dominant species, and you have to be able to regulate your life cycle through the season in a way that takes advantage of the different niches that appear during the season. So the reason why there are so many species here is because the dominant species are similar but not the same, and the subordinate species have a particular set of adaptations that allows them to come in and take advantage of the little spaces that have been left and the little opportunities that the dominant species haven't got to. So coming back to the analogy with the pizza, here we have a huge ingredients list. We have 64 species, and the way that they're assembled to live together, the way that the pizza is baked, is more of an immediate process of ecological interactions. So one of the reasons for understanding this biodiversity, understanding how the plant community has formed, how the vegetation is maintained, is about conserving species for the future, but also about conserving traditional ways of life, understanding how to conserve this kind of environment. And I think essentially there's one main message that comes out of this. This environment, these grasslands, these species-rich arid grasslands are here because people have mown them and maintained them. Now at the moment there are several owners of this grassland, several owners of different parcels of grassland, and they're all old men. And they come out here and they mow because they've come to really love it. And one of them in fact told me that he cuts it, and he cuts it in a way which is in which he takes into account the flowering times of the orchids, because he wants to see them. So this environment is maintained and conserved by the action of a few individuals who are older and who, in line with much of society at the moment, have tried to better their sons and daughters who have gone to the city to work in a bank or whatever. And the younger generations then aren't used to this kind of work. They don't necessarily appreciate it, they don't want to do it, it's not what they see in their future. And essentially, the main reason why we're going to lose these habitats is because the younger generations don't necessarily want to maintain them. They either don't understand them, don't appreciate them, or simply don't want the hard work that goes with maintaining this kind of environment. So climate change is going to be an important factor in the future, certainly. Things like nitrogen deposition from pollution, they're all important things, yes. But I think, from what I've seen, my own personal observation of these kinds of environments, there is one main threat to biodiversity, and that is land use change. And this, I think, brings us to the real point of this video. Conserving species such as orchids, okay, it's not necessarily about the orchids, conserving environments, it's all about conserving traditional ways of life, it's all about conserving traditional approaches to agriculture in marginal environments, especially in the mountains, and that means shaping young minds, getting an appreciation of these aspects of the environment and biology, ecology. And I think that personally I'm uniquely placed working in an agriculture department at the university. I'm uniquely placed to talk to young people and try and get them enthusiastic about this kind of sociological aspect of conservation. And really the future is talking to young people. And I think that having the possibility of doing that through a medium such as videos, which can reach anyone, I think that's fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to carry on with my scientific research. Maybe I'll write a book, who knows, but I think the best way of reaching people is this. So thank you for joining me. I'll be coming back here through the months as the season progresses, as the plants grow, as the orchids flower. Hopefully we'll see their pollinators as well, but I'll try my best to capture on video the most interesting aspects of this environment, and I hope that you come to appreciate it and to appreciate the link with traditional ways of life and agriculture. Thank you very much. blah blah, and I've forgotten what I was going to say, but it was going to be really interesting. It was, I promise. Like stunningly interesting it was going to be. Just completely evaporated, gone.